Baseball is a game of statistics, but there are so many out there and so many that are used prominently that maybe aren't the best ones. So today I want to talk about what are the numbers that I'm looking at first when I evaluate a hitter. What are some luck indicators? What is batting average on balls in play? And so much more. So we'll get into all of that next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. My name is Ben Kaspick, and on the show we provide daily episodes Monday through Friday, talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and RotoGraphs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, and I'm a lifelong fan. Thanks for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get podcasts. And coming up on today's show, with the Giants game being postponed yesterday and a doubleheader set for today, I wanted to take this opportunity to continue kind of our walk down the Sabermetrics 101 lane. I just think that it's something I enjoy doing. A lot of people have expressed an interest in hearing about this from time to time. And so I'm just going to talk about when I open up a player page, like what is it exactly that I'm looking at to evaluate a hitter? Because if you listen to Friday's episode, you sure know it's not batting average, home runs, and RBI. We spent pretty much the whole episode talking about why those are flawed and what's better. But I want to kind of take that a step further. So that's probably a good place to start if you're really interested in this topic, is the episode titled something like The Problem with Average Home Runs and RBI to Evaluate a Hitter. But when I look at an offensive player, there are so many different things that I look at. Why don't we start with one that a lot of people have questions about, which is batting average on balls in play. Contrary to kind of popular belief, this is not just a luck indicator. I think a lot of times people will say, oh, well, his average on balls in play is 400. He's just been lucky. That is not what it means, to me at least. If you're on a torrid hot streak, you're going to be running up a high average on balls in play, and it's hard for me to say there's anything about luck factoring into that. Certainly, it could be part of the equation. You could be getting a bunch of bloop hits, but ultimately, it's not necessarily a luck indicator. I actually talked about this just the other day with home run to fly ball ratio. It's not that it's a luck indicator, it's that it's a sustainability indicator. So if you're running a average on balls in play that is just significantly above either your career average, and by average I mean your career norm in this category, or it's significantly above the league average, then we can pretty comfortably state that you're not going to be able to sustain that number. And the other key factor here is that we look at that number and then we look at the rest of the overall picture. And so, for example, I'm looking at Brandon Belt right now, just kind of randomly. So far in 2022, he has a 389 average on balls in play. His career average on balls in play is 323. So it's above that. It's nothing crazy. I think Joey Bart has like almost a 600 average on balls in play. It's 571. So maybe he's a better person to talk about, because for Bart, there's just absolutely no way that he's going to be able to sustain anything like that. There are some guys who can have a higher average on balls in play than others, and typically it's your fast players because they just get more hits on balls in play because they're able to beat out hits, versus slower players aren't able to do that. But for Bart, his career average on balls in play in the major leagues now is just, or not just, but it's 411. So nobody sustains an average on balls in play anything like that. So we know that over the course of time, that number is going to come down. And all these different projection systems on Fangraphs have Bart ultimately coming in with an average on balls in play ranging from 311 to 331. So call it, 320 or something, but there's almost 100 points that are going to come off of that probably with more exposure to, major league pitching. But what's key about this, when I said you got to compare it to other metrics, is that by weighted runs created plus, where 100 is league average, that's pretty much all you need to know. It's all encompassing. 100 is average. Anything below that, Bart career 89 weighted runs created plus. So he's been 11 percentage points below average offensively in his major league career, according to this number. So when it requires a 411 average on balls in play to achieve below average overall production, that's when you can make the connection and say that that is a concern, because you know that the sustainability number there, average on balls in play, is going to come down. And when that comes down, that overall number that's already below average is likely to go even more below average. So there's more in play here. I wouldn't definitively make that declaration for Joey Bart. Like, part of the issue in Bart's career line is that he's also struck out 39% of the time. So he doesn't give himself enough opportunities to put the ball in play, because when you strike out, the BABIP number doesn't even come into play. So you can even if you were the miracle worker and you somehow were able to sustain a 500 average on balls in play, if you were striking out 90% of the time, even if you got a hit every time that you put a ball in play, you'd still only have a 100 batting average, right? Because in 90% of your at-bats, you're striking out, or 90% of your plate appearances. So that's kind of the extreme example. Of course, those numbers don't apply to anyone really, but this is just kind of how these different numbers come into play. But for Bart, we can look at that and say he needs to reduce his strikeout rate, because he needs to give himself more opportunities on balls in play. So someone else to look at for average on balls in play is Tyro Estrada, kind of on the flip side. So for Estrada this season in 2022, we're talking about 34 plate appearances here, but he only has a 231 batting average on balls in play. So it's not, again, that he's been unlucky necessarily, but it does mean when he's put the ball in play, he's only getting a hit 23% of the time. His career average in this category, spanning, he's not been around very long in the major leagues, but is 272. So we're talking about 40 points added to the average on balls in play to get to his career norm in this category. However, despite that, even though he's rolling out, a below average on balls in play, he's still been able to be 11 percentage points above league average by weighted runs created plus. And the way he's done it is with power, right? So he has a 265 on base percentage, which is significantly worse than league average, yet he's been above average overall. And so I can actually look at this and say kind of the opposite of what we were saying about Joey Bart, and say that there's room for growth with Tyro Estrada, because once that average on balls in play number comes up to more or less his career norm, or the league average is even higher than Estrada's career norm. So actually the projections for Estrada have him coming in between 292 and 304, which I think is more or less the league average. So if he's able to do that and continue to hit for the kind of power that he's hit for, there's an even better player than what we've seen potentially within Tyro Estrada. So I hope that kind of explains how we can use average on balls in play. I wouldn't just look at that and say Estrada's been unlucky. It's more like, I do also want to point out that a home run does not count as a ball in play in this case. And so for Estrada, he's hit those 2 home runs. If those were, doubles, that average on balls in play number would be higher. But that's why it's also important to look at something like home run to fly ball ratio. And for Estrada, it's 28.6%. And actually, his career home run to fly ball ratio is 22.8%. So it's not that different than his career home run to fly ball ratio. And actually, that's quite a good home run to fly ball ratio. For Joey Bart in his career, just by way of example, it's only 8.7% of his fly balls have been homers. This year, 100% of Joey Bart's fly balls have been homers. So I guess he's hit 2 fly balls, and they've both left the park. So that is why Bart is such an interesting case right now. He's got the 571 average on balls in play. He's got the 100% home run to fly ball ratio. He's got the 50% strikeout rate. These are just like bonkers numbers in some really interesting areas. He's also got a 15.4% walk rate, which is a huge improvement over what we saw in 2020 when he was kind of thrust into the major leagues. So anyway, I hope I explained a little bit how those 3 or 2 numbers specifically play into each other. I want to pull up here the league average just to give you an idea. The league average on balls in play right now in 2022 is just 283. It often starts off slow, and then as summer kind of kicks in, that number ends up going higher. So I actually want to pull up 2021 as well. The 2021 league average BABIP was 292. And again, right now it's 283 in 2022. And how about the home run to fly ball ratio? Well, it is in 2022 10.5%, and in 2021 it was 13.6%. So that actually aligns with what I've seen. We've seen a lot of balls kind of caught on the warning track. The Giants have hit a lot of those balls, but 10 to 14%. And again, Tyro Estrada homering on 23% of his fly balls. So this is a number where you can overperform the league average, but also if you're like Joey Bart and you're rolling with 100%, you know that that's going to come down. And so it means that a lot of the other stuff has to come down because you're going to start making outs when you put the ball in play more, right? And you can see how it ties in with the average on balls in play in that way. So coming up next, more of the numbers I'm looking at, we're going to talk about a lot. We're going to talk about some Statcast data. We're going to introduce barrel percentage, launch angle, stuff like that. So all that in just a minute. But first, BetOnline is your number one source for all your sports betting stats and info. Find all the latest sports development, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball playoffs and the start of the Major League Baseball season. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. I would look at the Cy Young odds on a guy like Carlos Rodon or Logan Webb. I keep talking about that. But the more they go out there and dominate, especially Rodon, I mean, kind of, if he can dominate the way that he has in his first 2 starts, that's the type of way that you end up being in play for a Cy Young award. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, as promised, I want to continue looking through what am I looking for when I look at a hitter. Like on Fangraphs, you can make a custom, I keep forgetting, like a custom, like you can customize the stats that you see for, when you pull up an offensive player. And so, yeah, I definitely have average on balls in play in there. It's an essential ingredient. I just gave a couple of examples, but there's the whole spectrum, right? And then it's, again, not a luck indicator, I would say, but a sustainability indicator. And for Belt, just to wrap that up, so it's 389 right now. He has such a long track record, and even last year when he had the monster season, the average on balls in play was just 309. So I have no reason to believe he's suddenly just going to have a 389 average on balls in play. So we know that's going to come down. But when the overall offensive line is so good, as we're seeing with Belt, 345 average, 441 on base, 690 slugging, there's no reason for me to think that he's doomed just because you regress the average on balls in play a little bit. So it can also tell me that even though that number is going to come down, I mean, we know he's not going to have a 216 weighted runs created plus all season, most likely. He's not reliant on that number being a little bit high. He's also got a 30% home run to fly ball ratio. His career norm is 12.8%. But in the last few years under this new regime, it's up around 20 to 27% the last couple of years. So it does seem like maybe Belt has been able to achieve a new level of home run to fly ball ratio, and it has to do with tangible changes that he's made to his swing and his approach. So that's another thing, is that if nothing has changed, we can always just kind of regress these numbers to a player's career average or the league average, or somewhere in between. But if someone's made a tangible change to their swing or their approach, then we need to maybe adjust our expectations based on these changes. And that's what I'm seeing with Belt's home run to fly ball ratios. So anyway, what else am I looking at? Let's talk about some of the Statcast numbers. So this is new relatively in the last 5+ years. We've started to get really good data from Statcast. So on this page that I have for looking at offensive players, I have the number of events because I want to know what the sample size is. So these are balls that were put in play that were tracked by Statcast. And then I have max exit velocity. I also have launch angle, and I have barrel percentage. So there's only so many stats you can fit in here. And so I remember grappling with like hard hit rate versus barrel percentage. So both of those I care about, but I do think barrel percentage is more meaningful. And in fact, this is one of my favorite metrics these days. And a barrel is not the old way of thinking about a barrel, which is like hitting the ball on the sweet spot, no matter if it's on the ground or a low line drive or in the air or whatever. A barrel, by the Statcast kind of definition, it's a MLB.com metric that's relatively new. And it's when you hit the ball, it has to be hard hit. So it has to be 95+ miles an hour. That's we've agreed that the definition of a hard hit ball is 95+ miles an hour off the bat. And a barrel has to be hard hit, and it has to be, I think, in a certain spectrum of launch angles that lead to similar batted balls being hits at least 50% of the time, and similar balls having at least a 1,500 expected slugging percentage. So that's 1,000 isolated power at least. And so anyway, it's ideal contact, hard hit in the air, basically contact. And so we can look at what is the rate of barrels for a player, like when they put the ball in play, how often is it that kind of contact? And for Brandon Belt this year, 19%. Last year, when he had that monster short kind of injury ravaged season, it was 17%. In 2020, when he was also really good in the short season, it was 17%. So it really does seem, when you see this consistent 17-ish% rate of barrels, it does seem like he's achieved a new level of doing that. And if you look back at 2019, 18, 17, and 16, and 15 for Brandon Belt, he was hovering more at around 8 to 11%. And so I see a tangible difference there. And barrel percentage is just a really, really strong indicator of how much damaging type of contact a hitter is making. So I want to pull up the league average barrel percentage here too. So in 2022, it's 8.3%. Last year it was 7.9%. So league average barrel rate is about 8%. And again, Brandon Belt has been living at about 17 to 19%. So more than double the rate of the league average player. Brandon Belt barreling the baseball. Again, hard contact in the air. So when we look at some other Giants this season, we've got Jock Peterson at 19%, Steven Duggar at 14%, Joey Bart at 22%, Darren Ruff at 9%. Again, that's close to league average. Yaz at 10.5%, Tyro Estrada only 7.1%. And that plays in again with some of these other numbers like average on balls in play. If you're not getting hits a lot of the time when you're putting the ball in play, you're probably not barreling the ball very often. But when Estrada has done it, he so often homers when he hits the ball in the air that it ends up being a productive overall profile, even if that average on balls in play is a little low. Wilmer Flores, 12%. Belt, like I said, 19%. Crawford, 22%. Dubon, Luke Williams, both at 0. Austin Slater at 10. And I think that that's everybody. So as you can see, as a team, the Giants have hit a lot of barrels relative to the league average. And I'm actually going to sort this here. And yeah, they're at 12.1% as a team, which is third best in all of baseball. And so this is, I don't want to call it a luck indicator, but when you're doing that, you are expected to be a team that's putting up a lot of runs and putting a hurting on your opponent. But the Giants so far, they've hit a lot of barrels that were caught. We actually made an episode called Giants Barrels Finding Gloves. And early on in the season, they were hitting these. Again, we know as soon as it's hit, is it a barrel? And they were hitting a lot of them that were finding gloves. So to see the Giants coming in third in the league in this category, and by the way, in hard hit rate, they're at 46.3%, which is also third in Major League Baseball. This is honestly among the most encouraging things you could see, because this is not dependent on the outcome. If you're hitting barrels and they're getting caught, before having Statcast around and these expected numbers and barrel percentage and stuff like that, it just looked like an out, right? Like in the old days when you would just look at a box score, it's an 0 for 1. But in reality, you should get some credit for hitting the ball like that. And that's basically what this is doing. And so now we know that, and actually numbers like expected weighted on base average versus actual weighted on base average are more predictive of your future performance. And so when I look at this, I see a team that is ready to break through, and that a lot of these barrels that they're hitting are going to not get caught, or they're going to go over the wall. And so I was really encouraged going into the last game in Cleveland, and sure enough, they absolutely broke out in that game. So the Giants are also 6th in launch angle, and on and on. There's more that we can look at there. But coming up next, I want to tie it all together and talk about how wins above replacement comes into play here, and how it's actually not that complicated. And really the reason for looking at WAR is kind of very straightforward, and it's something that we really should be doing. But first, this episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure the often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning? Is your Odyssey an LX or an EX? And wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry. You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. So why choose to spend 30, 50, or even 100% more for the exact same part from a chain store or car dealership? Random example, Honda Odyssey fuel pump, $353 from a chain store, just $216 from Rock Auto. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need, rockauto.com. All right, as promised, I want to talk about how wins above replacement is not that crazy of a thing. I know it's somehow like controversial, but I'm going to explain why it's really straightforward and something that we absolutely should be paying attention to, and also some of the pitfalls and the common mistakes I see when this number gets thrown around. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. For your next listen, check out the Locked On Now podcast, recaps of MLB games with analysis from our local experts, taking fans through the season like no other network. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. So yeah, wins above replacement for hitters and for pitchers is similar, but let's just talk about it. They're different in some ways. So I want to talk about for position players, hitters. So first of all, we have to keep in mind that different sources have different wins above replacement calculations. And so I see this all the time, even on television broadcasts and, people citing these numbers. It is not an objective number. It is a number that is formulated by a website like Fangraphs or Baseball Reference. When a guy goes to the plate and strikes out, it's indisputable. That is objective. Like, he had an at-bat, he had a plate appearance, he was 0 for 1, and he struck out. But for WAR, it's not that straightforward, right? I mean, I think that's where people don't like this number, is they're like, where is it coming from? I'm going to a game, I'm seeing these guys play. I don't see them accumulating wins above replacement. And yet that's what they're doing. But so when we talk about if we're using Fangraphs and we're looking at their WAR number, we have to call it Fangraphs WAR. When we're using Baseball Reference and looking at their wins above replacement, we have to call it Baseball Reference WAR. And so that's why you'll see B WAR, like the lowercase b, and then capital WAR. That's Baseball Reference WAR. F WAR, lowercase f, is Fangraphs wins above replacement. So anyway, it's important to cite which of the websites you're using. And then also a mistake I see is like when you look at Fangraphs, you've got an offensive column, a defensive column, and then a WAR column. This is not offensive WAR, defensive WAR, and then overall WAR. This is offensive runs above average, defensive runs above average, and then it's being formulated together to put into the overall WAR category. You've also got base running runs above average. So essentially all WAR is doing here is combining what are you doing as a base runner, what are you doing as an offensive player, and what are you doing as a defensive player. So it's extremely straightforward, and it's just a number that is attempting to combine all of the different things you're doing on a field. Because if you're just looking at hitting, you're ignoring defense and base running. If you're just looking at hitting and defense, you're ignoring base running. If you're just looking at defense, you're ignoring hitting and base running. You get what I'm saying. So all WAR is trying to do is combine the various things that you're doing and put them into one simple number. And so every front office has their own. That's the thing. It's like they're not just taking another source's WAR calculation. They very likely have their own. I believe it's established that every team has their own formula for wins above replacement. And again, it's important to note that it's wins above replacement. It's not just wins straight up added. And so a replacement level player, I forget the exact definition, and I think different sources have different ways that they concretely define this, but it's essentially those extra guys like on a bench who would be playing more if your more regular guys weren't available. And so it's like wins added above the production you would get from those types of players, replacement level players that every team has that they aren't quite good enough to play and that you'd rather have somebody else playing at those positions. So I think what's most important about wins above replacement is simply that it's attempting to combine offense, defense, and base running. And again, on Fangraphs, we could go into these at a later date, but essentially base running runs above average. It's important to count base running. We've seen it with the Giants. They've been a bad base running team. This year, there were some troubles early on. It hasn't really come up in the last week or so, but Mauricio Dubon has been a troubled base runner, and they had problems last year in this category as well. So it's important to count that. It matters. It affects the game. It affects run scoring. And then, of course, defense, which, by the way, for Fangraphs, is factoring in the position you play. So when you see a negative number, it doesn't automatically mean that a player is a bad defensive player. Like Brandon Belt in his career is at negative 55.6 in this column that just says defense. And so I can see most people are going to see that and just think, oh, I guess this site thinks he's a bad defender. But no, it's because he plays first base. He's actually one of the best first base defenders according to this defense metric on Fangraphs, which is, again, defensive runs above average, and it factors in what position you play. So he's a good defensive first baseman. If you're a bad defensive first baseman, this number is much more negative. So a negative number doesn't automatically mean that you are a bad defender. A DH gets a hugely negative number because they're providing zero defensive value. So anyway, that's kind of my quick way to summarize that. I just think that those different points are pretty important and often get missed. So anyway, that was a lot to cram in, but thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On MLB. Paul Francis Sullivan, please call him Sully, brings you his unique perspective on the majors, past and present. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to be talking about everything that's going on here with this doubleheader in New York. Today, Giants versus Mets, 2 games, 9 innings each, not 7. So that'll be fun, and we'll have a lot to talk about, so please come back for tomorrow's show. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. You can check me out on Twitter at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. And if you like this show, please consider rating it or leaving a review. It helps out a lot. So thanks in advance, and thank you so much to everyone who's done so already. I can't wait to be with you again tomorrow. Thanks again for listening. Stay Locked On Giants.